Yeah. Okay. So why don't we get started? We had learned this halacha on Friday that and Marv, you had sent out an article, I guess, on
I don't know if it's for sale material for rental. Landlord can actually kick the tenant out for not for cause, not for breach or anything like that. If he needs the apartment for himself or his family member, he ends up living there for at least a year after he kicks him out. Comes back within a year, it's going to be bad faith, and he's just give him an excuse or whatever and move back in. Mm-hmm. But in our case, it seemed to me that's exactly what he needs. His deal fell through for his job. He wants his place back. So in Ontario, he could get it back.
He could get it back.
He could get it back if he's in good faith. Like in this case, he would be good faith.
Right. But according to the way the Reb Shiraga paskined, he has to say at the time that he's renting or selling the apartment, I'm only selling because I need to take a job out of town. Okay. Aval im bishata chatima lo kain. But
Sorry,
yeah.
I've been away for a while. Are we still starting at 6:10 or are you starting a little earlier?
We started at 6:10.
All right.
Welcome, Shlomo.
Thank you.
Aval, however, im bishata chatima lo amar kain. But if he did not say that at the time that the contract was signed, afilu shahadavar yadua shu tzarich lekabel es hatafkid b'bnei barak, enu yachol lachzor bo. If nothing was stated at the time of the signature, then he's not able to retract on the deal. And that's that's quite interesting. And that's what leads the annotator at the bottom to say, Amnam ayin barama shekasa, but he says, I refer you to the Rama who writes, Mihu iika umda de demucha itbatel hamekach. If there's something that is patently obvious, that in other words, that would indicate that the sale should no longer be valid, so then you can undo the sale. Dahainu afilu imlo hizkir shum inyan bishat hamichira. That means that seems to imply that even if nothing is mentioned at the time of the signing of the contract, im yadua lukulam dehu mocher diraso ach verak biglal avodato al hamekach bato. If it is known to all that the whole reason he's selling or leasing his apartment is because of work-related issues, and then he doesn't end up getting the transfer, so then the sale can be nullified. And it seems like the Machaber holds the same way also. He says, and therefore there would be room for us to argue in a case like ours, that if everyone present, the buyer and the seller and the witnesses, everyone is aware that the whole sale is going through because he needs to move to Bnei Brak, uvesof matza avoda b'Yerushalayim, and at the last minute he finds work in Jerusalem, haya makom levatel mechiras dirasa. There would be room for him to nullify the sale, even though nothing was stated explicitly, but it was already known. Amnam ayin b'shayla suchuvas boy chaye lebal hakneses agdoila, shehevi sham das haposkim ha'im danim hayom al pi umdana demucha cholam. There is a deliberation in one of the earlier achronim as to whether we can rely on umdana demuchach, something which is patently obvious that is not specified. Kevin shahayom einenu bikim kolkach ladun al pi umdana. It may not be so simple nowadays that the basin can say, oh, this was obvious. Ve'al kain kosov b'shem kama poskim delo azlin basar umdana lahutzi elarak lahachzik ayin sham. He says, and therefore there would be some poskim who would say that you can't just follow a patently obvious fact if nothing has been explicated. You can only do that to hold on to property that is already in your possession. But if the keys have already been transferred, so then you can't use an umdana demuchach. הרי ייתכן דאין זה עומדא דמוכח משום שהזכיר דירסו בשביל עוד כמה סיבות שאינם ידועות לנו, ועל כן אין להוציא מהסוחר. And therefore, in our situation, perhaps you could argue that once the renter has taken possession of the apartment, then maybe the renter could say, well, I didn't know that he was only leasing me the apartment because of work-related issues. There could have been other factors as well. ומלבד זאת, אין בבייס יוסף שהקשה סתירה בראשים עומדא דמוכח צריך לומר כן בפיו או לא. And furthermore, the Beis Yosef presents us with an apparent contradiction from the Rush's commentary as to whether you have to verbally speak out a patently obvious condition. And therefore, if something was never specified verbally, there's a good argument to make that once the renter has taken possession, you don't have a right to take it away from him. So this would be drawing a distinction between whether the renter has taken possession of the apartment yet by taking the keys, or if it's before the fact, even after they've signed the contract. Once they've signed the usually you transfer the keys once they sign the contract, right? And that's considered to be the tenant has taken possession of the apartment. So
Yeah, you could ask for it.
So the deposit is given at the time of the signing of the contract, usually, no? Is that what happens? Okay. It's been a long time since I rented an apartment. Okay. All right. So so just to be clear, we're drawing a distinction between whether it's before the renter takes possession or after the renter takes possession. When you're dealing with a patently obvious situation. If it's after he's already taken possession, he's taken the keys, then it has to be specified verbally at the time that the keys have been given over. I hate to give up my apartment. I'm only doing it because I'm moving to Bnei Brak next month or next week or whatever. Okay. I don't think he drew it didn't make a difference. He said either one. Yeah. Okay, let's go to the next tshuva. This is the next packet of material. Nishba shelo yimkor diraso umachra ha'im hamecher chal. If a person took a vow that he's not going to sell his apartment and he ended up selling it, is the sale valid? So that sounds like a bizarre shaila. Let's see the situation. Ani shutaf im chaveri b'dira lahashka'a. I'm a partner with my friend in an apartment that was purchased as an investment. Okay, uva'avar nishpati shala'olam lo emkar lo es chelki badira. Previously, I took a vow to my partner. There's no way I'm ever going to sell him my portion in the apartment. Now, maybe the guy kept asking him, hey, let me buy you out. I want to give this apartment to one of my kids, and the guy says, no, we're equal partners. Either I'll buy you out or we'll remain partners, but I'm not selling. And the guy kept hocking him, and he says, I take a shvua. I'm never selling my portion. Amnam acher zman rav shutafi ifsir bi rabos ve'achar dinu dvarim acharti lo eschalki badira. But after a bunch of hocking at Chinik, he put a lot of pressure on me. And we started, and after a lot of negotiation, we finally agreed that I would sell him my portion in the apartment. And now I have remorse. Can I argue that the vow that I had taken previously can nullify the sale? In other words, this guy has got a real prince of a partner, I guess, and he's been pressuring him, and finally he got to him at a weak moment, But now the guy realizes, what did I do? I shouldn't have sold it. The prices are going through the roof. Can I nullify the sale, even though we've already signed the contract, um, by saying that, well, I had previously vowed, I took a vow that I was not going to sell him. Maybe that could be a mitigating factor in my being allowed to nullify the sale after the fact. So he writes as follows: Kasav bahagos Mordechai besof maseches shvuos, demisha nishba o kibel al atzmo becherem shelo yiteno shelo yimkaro shelo yimchol ezedavar va'avar al shvuas u'machar ein b'masav klom. So the Mordechai actually writes at the end of Tractate Shavuot that if a person swears or took upon himself, like, in other words, there's different ways of committing yourself verbally. You can either take a vow, you can take an oath, you can say, may a ban be placed upon me if I violate what I'm about to say. And I made a verbal commitment that I'm not going to give or sell or forgive a particular item, right, or a particular transaction or financial relationship. And I've ended up violating my shavua and I ended up selling, so my action is null and void. Zeu al pi masha hagemara omeret bichatuvot, kevin de omer rabbanon lo lisbon, izavin lo hava zvine zvina. He says, we have a principle that once the chachamim tell you not to sell something, if you sell it, the sale is void. Whereas even though you are doing you're performing a transaction now, but if it's in violation of something the chachamim said not to do, then they can nullify the sale. If that works just by a rabbinic law, certainly it should hold true if a person is bound by a verbal commitment that the Torah binds him to. We also know that there's a machlokas between Abaye and Rava in the Gemara, that when the Torah says don't do something, if you did it, does that action work? And there's, of course, a lot of circumstances behind that statement. Under what conditions does it apply and not apply? And we generally paskin like Rava with some rare exception. And Rava says that whatever you try to do, if the Torah says not to do it, so then your action is null and void. Zos, pasak harash, the mekach shenasa be'isr hamekach kaim. Rush says, nonetheless, that if you sell something that is not permitted for you to sell, for whatever reason, the sale is still valid. The hevi ra'ilazem mehagemara b'bava mitzia, chen kasvu haramban v'harashba, v'lachein ein hamocher yichol levatel mekach b'shvil shenasa be'isr. And therefore, even if you sold something in a prohibited way, let's say I performed a transaction on Shabbos, right? And now I want to nullify the transaction because I said, well, it was done in a prohibited way because it's usher to perform transactions on Shabbos. You can't nullify a transaction just because it was done in a prohibited way. So we have a bit of a conflict here. On the one hand, we know a principle that if the Torah tells you or the rabbis tell you not to do something, they can nullify that. But on the other hand, you have these Rishonim who say that any transaction that was done on Be'isr still is binding. Amnam zeh dafka imasu kinyan mecher gamo. Okay, so based on the latter thing that we just said, you can't nullify the sale, but that's only if a kinyan was affected. Aval im halokeach rak shilim kesef v'lo asa kinyan. But let's say the buyer, the partner who wants to buy me out, has just given me cash as a down payment, let's say, but there was no kinyan. Afal pisha b'derech klal rabbanan tiknu shemisha nasan kesef v'lo mashach im yaktzor b'utzarach lekablo love kilalas misha para midor hamabel midor haflagum mitzrayim beyam hu yifram mishalo omed b'diburo. Normally we say that a person who goes back on a transaction where only money was exchanged hands, has to accept upon himself a curse, right? Remember, that's what we learned last week. That if a person, either the buyer or the seller, says, I know I gave you money, but I want the money back, or the seller says, I know I took your money, but I'm giving you the money back, even though the rabbi said that the sale has not been fully consummated, and therefore he's within his rights to do that, but he still has to accept upon himself a curse, that he who exacted vengeance from the generation of the flood and the generation of the dispersion at the Tower of Babel from the Egyptians at the Red Sea, he should exact vengeance from a person like yourself who doesn't fulfill his word. But that's only true under normal circumstances where the person who's backing out of the deal has no legitimate reason. But b'mikra shehamekach haya b'isser, ein kan mi shapara imrod salach sorba. But in a situation like this, where the transaction was done in a forbidden way, like let's say we performed the transaction on Shabbos and you gave me money, and now I say, you know what, I feel bad. I should never have taken your money on Shabbos. It was wrong, and I'm giving you your money back. Such a person does not get a mishapara curse. Okay? So therefore, it seems like he's leaning towards the idea that it will all depend if the transaction was consummated or not. If there was a transaction that was consummated, you can't go ahead and say, well, I did it under Isser because I violated my vow. However, if there was no transaction yet, then you would be allowed to go back on the deal. Right. Well, remember, we paskin that with certain transactions, let's say with metaltalin, with chattel, let's say I'm selling you this book, okay? If you give me cash for it and you don't pick up the book, the transaction has not been fully consummated, as long as the book is still in my possession. But property, the transfer of cash is a complete transaction. And so it all depends on whether the transaction has been fully effected or not. So Umaran b'Shulchan Aruch Pasak Mekach Shenasa be'Isser Kigon Shahaya Isser Ribis v'Niskayim beKinyan O be'Echad Midarchei Haknos Ein Echad Mehem Yachol Levatal Asa Mekach. So the Shulchan Aruch talks about another such scenario where a transaction was done in a prohibited fashion. Let's say built into the transaction is the taking of interest. So the sale of the property is 100,000, but you can opt to pay me over the course of the year, and you'll pay me at a rate of 10% interest over the course of the year, so that by the end of the year you'll owe me $110,000. Okay, you're not allowed to do that, but the transaction is still legally binding, even though built into the contract is a prohibited clause. And I think, like in secular law too, we say that there's something at the end of the contract that says if any of these severability, that's the word. Like in other words, if there's something wrong with any particular section of this contract, it doesn't nullify the rest of the contract. That's essentially what the Shulchan Aruch is saying. Because of Harama, duhu adinim nishba shelo yimkor lechaver va'over amachar shamekach chaim. And the Ramah says the exact case that we're discussing now. The same halacha will apply that if a person swore that he would not sell to this guy the item, and he goes ahead and sells it, even though he's committing an isser in the transaction itself, the transaction is still legally binding. Ela ditzarachiyun bazeh ki harama atzmo behilchos nedarim kasaf. But the problem is there seems to be something of a contradiction, because in Hilchos Nedarim, which is not in Choshen Mishpat, but it's in Yoredeya, the laws of Nedarim are the laws of vows, and how a person has to fulfill whatever commitments and vows that he makes. Okay, and there the Ramah writes, Yesh Omrim, the Kol Mi Shenishba Shalo Lasos Ezadaber Kagon Shenishba Shalo Limser, bless you, Chayfetz Ploni Va'avar Umachro, Ein B'Mechuraso Klum Hol Va'avar Al Shvuasa. So the Ramah seems to contradict himself. He says that there's a certain opinion that says that if a person took a vow that he was not going to sell a particular item, and he goes ahead and sells it, then the sale is null and void. So isn't since he has violated his shavua, so he seems to be contradicting himself in the laws of mechira. He says the Ramah paskins that even if there was something prohibited, like violating your vow, the sale is still valid. And in the laws of Nidarim, the Ramah says that the sale is completely null and void. So v'hisper hataz hatam hu al pi haklal dechol da'omer rachmana lo savidi avid lo mahani midi. And the Taz explains in Hilchos Nidarim that it's because the Ramah, according to that opinion, is holding that whatever you do that is in violation of the Torah is not effective. The kasha de lefize yotze shaharamah soser is atzmo. That's a steer in the Ramah. Big problem, right? Ba'ayin b'sma sheherich bazeh v'hisik deha'ikar kamo shepasak harama b'hilchos nedarim dehanish b'shalalim karu mochar ein mechiroso klon. The Sma in Choshen Mishpat, realizing that the Ramah has contradicted himself, comes to the conclusion that the Ramah in Hilchos Nedarim is correct, and not like he writes in Hilchos Mekachu Memkar, Choshen Mishpat. So the Taz, he says, Hiksha al Maskanas Asma. The Taz challenges what the Sma has written. Mimasha Pasaka Shulchan Aruch, the Adam Shekana Chayfetz Biyom HaShabbos, Afal Pi Shechilalas HaShabbos HaMekach Kayin. We have another place in Choshen Mishpat that says that if a person purchases an item on Shabbos, even though what he did was prohibited and he was Machalal Shabbos, the sale is still valid. So we see that we don't say that if you did something prohibited, it's not effective. And based on that, the Taz comes to the exact opposite conclusion of the Sma and says that no, that the Ramah in Choshen Mishpat is really the correct psak, that even though you violated your Shavua, the sale is still valid. Ubir hataz the hamocher b'Shabbos kivin she'ein ha'isr beguf ha'isga v'rak ha'isr machmas davar acher shehayom gorem lochein ha'isga kayemes u'mo'ila ha'mechira b'Shabbos. So the Taz draws a very interesting distinction. He says that the reason why, even though normally we say avid lo mahani, if you do something that is in violation of the Torah, that action is not legally effective. He says, so then why is it that if you perform a transaction on Shabbos, the transaction is effective? So the Taz says a very interesting distinction. He says, since the prohibition on Shabbos does not involve the body of the transaction, in other words, there's nothing faulty in the transaction itself, other than the Torah says, or the rabbi said, do not transact on Shabbos. So there's nothing in the mechanism of the transaction, there's nothing defective. Do you hear the distinction? Right? In other words, there's nothing defective about the transaction itself, but there's an external prohibition of performing transactions. But in the act of the transaction, everything was done properly. And that's why the transaction is effective. Yeah. Well, the transaction was already affected, it would seem. Even Lloyd, that's an interesting shaila. When is the transaction consummated? Could it be argued that as soon as the delivery person takes delivery, then it's yours? We probably don't say that. We probably say that the transaction is consummated when it lands on your property. And if it happens on Shabbos, right? So you're raising a good point. You're saying that You have to say that the transaction is legal, because otherwise, I haven't acquired it until after Shabbos. I don't know.
But if you miss that opportunity and it flows on to the next one, it's probably you can't get out.
Well, but normally, Doug, we say that anything that lands on my property and I'm happy with it, my property acquires it automatically. I don't have to state it. Yeah, Gemara talks about that with vis-a-vis a get. If a husband throws his wife a get and it lands on her lawn, so then, right, then from that point forward, she's divorced. Okay, but anyway, these are all interesting shilas as far as like variations on this shaila. Could we argue that your property does not acquire for you on Shabbos since it's not something you're supposed to be doing? Okay, interesting. Let's get back to this. So the argument that the Taz makes could also be made, that he makes for Shabbos, could also be made vis-a-vis the Shvuah. There's nothing defective in the mechanism of the transaction itself. It's just that there was a previous oath that I had made that makes it forbidden for me to transact on this particular item or property. The habach kosav kevin shezem achlokas haposkim klal gadol yesh biyadenu hamotzi mechavero olav haraya. The Bach writes, we now have a machloikas. We see in one place the Ramah paskins that the sale is valid. In another place, the Ramah says that the sale is null and void. Whenever you have a machlokas haposkim, that we say hamotzi mechavero olav haraya. So if my partner who pressured me to sell him my share already has taken possession, then I don't have a right to. It says v'keven shvar mocher lo eschelko b'dira v'hasheni asa b'kinyan. So since I've already sold him, we made a kinyan zacha hashutov b'dira ve'ein lo mocher la'arer al hamachira. Therefore, the buyer, the partner who was the hacker, and has prevailed halachically, and the seller cannot complain that, oh, I sold it under pressure. I had vowed that I wasn't going to sell. And that's especially true because that seems to be the psak of the Beit Yosef, which for Sfardim is the prevailing psak. So while it seems from Rav Sharaga, there may be what to talk about if you're an Ashkenazi, because this is all a controversy that is in the Ramah. Certainly for us Sephardim, he says, there's much less room to say that the guy can complain about the sale and raise objections to it. Okay. But this is in itself a very interesting principle, that if you do something, if you transact in a forbidden way, then the transaction could still be legally binding, as long as the method of transaction is not in itself inherently defective. Yeah. It's legally valid, yeah. And that's how we paskin. So Nit Shabbos Garet, how much you selling your car? Right? Like the old joke. That's why we need to move the tables back to the front of the shul. There's too many transactions going on in the shul. Okay, we'll hold it here for today, guys.